First thing, I want to apologize for not putting this podcast up yesterday, but I knew that you guys would want some election commentary. And waiting 24 hours to see what happened is much more valuable than giving you predictions early. So let's get to it. Welcome back to another episode of T-Rex Talk. No guest today. We're just going to be talking about some different things that happened during the election. Obviously, there's been lots of coverage. You've probably been paying attention. You probably know that Donald Trump, at the time of this recording, has tons of electoral votes and has won the popular vote. And the Republicans flipped the Senate, and they're probably going to take the House. And there are 27 Republican governors at the moment. So pretty much across the board, clean sweep. But I want to look at some specific races. I want to look at some specific comments, and I want to take some takeaways from the whole thing. So one of my favorites is that Liz Cheney lost her seat. It was only a couple of days ago that Liz Cheney was on The View, and Whoopi Goldberg was saying, like, when Kamala Harris wins, she needs to put you in charge of the CIA and the FBI. She could be the director of both departments, I believe, and then she could hunt down all the Trump supporters. But according to the popular vote, there's way too many Trump voters for Liz Cheney to find. She's not going to have either of those two directorships, and she also lost her seat. So, you know, things change quickly in politics. There were a bunch of really important things on different ballots in addition to the individual politicians. There were a number of constitutional amendments in a bunch of states. The abortion ones are the ones that I paid the most attention to. Florida has an abortion amendment that was overturned. It failed to pass, which was good, but only failed by 3%. And then there are 7 or 8 other amendments that add the right to abortion to state constitutions that passed in other states. Florida's legalized weed amendment also lost. Bunch of stuff happened here in Tennessee that was kind of interesting. Gloria Johnson is a Democratic politician. She is one of the Tennessee Three. The Tennessee Three are people who caused a lot of trouble a couple years ago, violated rules, and were expelled for it. And they, of course, wore that as a badge of honor and turned it into a huge amount of public attention from the mainstream media. The idea was that Gloria Johnson, technically, it was really the Tennessee 2, but she really hung on to the Tennessee 2 and made it a Tennessee 3. So good for her, including herself that way. A lot of people thought that she had a good shot at overturning Marsha Blackburn going to D.C. as one of Tennessee's representatives, but the most recent polls said that she was 20 points behind. When the dust settled, she was actually more like 45 points behind. She had 18% of the vote. So, yeah, other Tennesseans like Andy Ogles kept his Tennessee seat. Some things really just stayed the same. Like Bernie Sanders, he kept his seat. He's 83 years old, but he's got another 6 years. Ryan Bussey is another guy that we've talked about here on the show. He wrote a book called Gunfight and is a pro-gun control guy. But he was running for governor of Montana, and he was pitching himself as a not pro-gun control guy, and he lost his election bid there. So he can now safely go back to being an anti-gun guy. I think he probably has whiplash at this point because he used to work for Kimber and sold a bunch of guns and worked directly with the NRA running marketing campaigns for Kimber because that was the best way that Kimber knew how to sell guns. And then when he bailed from Kimber, he went to work on the Biden administration's, the Obama campaign, sorry. And then he started to work for Giffords, and then he wrote a book called Gunfight, which we reviewed on the podcast. If you go back a couple of years, you can find that review. It's kind of interesting to talk through it. But yeah, he's a senior advisor to Giffords on gun control measures, and he kind of tried to be a pro-gun guy for this particular Montana race. But he still is like an expert witness that is brought in on gun control cases for the other side. So the amount of both sides playing that he tries to do is kind of interesting. Yeah, his campaign ads for Montana governor bragged about how he personally had sold millions of guns, but yeah, stuff that he writes for Giffords next week is going to be the exact opposite of that. Sherrod Brown is another really long-time gun control advocate in Ohio. He's a senator, and he's out. And that's kind of interesting because that was the costliest U.S. Senate race in American history. Republicans and Democrats spent $477 million on that race. The trend is people are spending more and more and more money on these races. So now that the dust is kind of settling, we should do some accounting and figure some of this stuff out. Interesting to note, Donald Trump spent about a third of the money that Kamala Harris spent on her campaign. So it isn't always money that gets the job done, but there's way more money that's involved. And that should raise some red flags and at least, should raise some interest. Why are these seats worth so much and to whom? Mainly, I would say that these seats are worth a lot to the big deep state. We've talked a little bit about that in the last couple of weeks. The regime is probably the better way to talk about it because deep state sounds conspiratorial. We made a video for T-Rex Labs last week talking about the deep state, and YouTube wouldn't let us put it up, not because of deep conspiratorial assassin-y type stuff, but because the BBC has such big, clunky, sluggish, stagnant copyright rules that we just can't post clips of it anywhere on YouTube. But it is on X, so we'll put a link maybe in the description of the video, possibly. You can check that out. The regime is really, really interesting. You can see this in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. voted 93% for Kamala Harris, the people that live in D.C., and the reason that Republicans will probably never flip Virginia ever again is because the bureaucracy itself, the regime itself, wants people like Kamala Harris to be in office and to control them and make sure that their coffers are full of money so that they will be there. That's a really interesting thing. It's another reminder that this election and probably future elections are going to be divided, not so much Republican and Democrat, as bureaucracy versus people, the state versus the citizenry, the regime against people like you and me. So, you'll have to go to Twitter to watch that video we made about the deep state because it's not allowed on YouTube. I also had a Twitter post go viral talking about Peanut the squirrel, another great example of how regime fans love the idea of jackbooted thugs coming into somebody's house and euthanizing his pet squirrel. And the people who care about the people did not like that idea, even though it was mostly Republicans and conservatives that were calling for justice for Peanut. Even the guy who owns Peanut is a hardcore liberal weirdo type character. And the reason that post that I wrote went viral was because Bill Ackerman shared it. Bill Ackerman's a fascinating guy. He's a super powerful, rich hedge fund manager who up until fairly recently has been super hardcore liberal Democrat aligned. But when the mainstream media came after his wife and attacked her as being some kind of plagiarist, which they did entirely to be a smokescreen as some other DEI hire at Harvard was being exposed for being a plagiarist, that kind of flipped a switch in Bill Ackerman's brain. He's now on the side of the people. He doesn't want to be part of the regime, and he's liking and sharing, retweeting my posts about squirrels. So we live in a strange, strange world at this point in time. There's a whole bunch of weird stuff that sort of revolved around the election. There was a gas leak in Michigan. There was a bunch of confrontations in Pennsylvania between poll workers and Republican poll observers. There were bomb threats in Georgia. The mainstream media said that there had never been bomb threats until Donald Trump came onto the scene, which is, I think historically pretty inaccurate. They also said that the bomb threats came from Russia, but the guy that was arrested for calling in the bomb threats was actually a poll worker, just a 25-year-old white guy, a leftist who works for the DeKalb County election group. So, it's probably not Russian. And then Google had this weird thing where you could get results for where to vote for Kamala Harris, but not for where to vote for Trump. And the reason for this was tied maybe in incompetence and not malevolence, but it took them a while to fix the bug. So there's all kinds of slightly weird stuff going on. But that being said, we got so many votes counted and calculated that I think that few people are going to really contest the results, the big results, even though there's lots of irregularities that should be noted. And the exit polls are really interesting. Georgia exit polls, despite some of the issues, showed that 25% of the black population there voted for Trump, very much not what the mainstream media had in mind. The Latino vote went for Trump. Young people came out for Trump in numbers that nobody expected. Nobody expected inside the mainstream media bubble, I would say. If you have totally swallowed intersectional politics, then you believe that a person's melanin count is going to drive the ballot count. But in real life, real people don't think that way. Like if you are in the Cuban community of Miami, you will care more about the ideology that you share with Trump than the skin tone that you have that kind of sort of matches Kamala Harris's. This seems really obvious to real people, and it seems utterly incomprehensible to mainstream media folks and regime people. So they were just blown away that Donald Trump was able to win the Miami-Dade County election by 10 points. This is the first time it's gone to a Republican since 1988, and he didn't just take it, he took it by 10 points. So these things should be wake-up calls for people who have followed really bad advice, really bad assumptions based on intersectional identity politics and leftists' talking points. But we will see if anyone actually wakes up from these things. Speaking of Texas and Florida, there was really fast vote counting in a whole bunch of red states and really slow, convoluted vote counting in other states. And it's pretty obvious the differences are so stark that people should be asking some questions about that. CBS actually said voting in swing states will take very long, and it doesn't mean anything nefarious is happening. When people assure you that nothing nefarious is happening, it should be like a little red flag for you. Some cities have stopped counting. I don't actually fully understand why, if they think they're going to find another 20 million votes between now and whenever, but yeah, we'll see. It's keep watching. But all of this stuff is really very overwhelming. The direction's overwhelming. The trend is overwhelming. Trump came this close to taking California, which is amazing. He's the first Republican to win Madison, New Hampshire in 32 years. He had more votes in Pennsylvania than any other Republican. And a lot of what pushed him over the edge is kind of an unexpected source. There were about 160,000 Amish farmers that registered to vote for this election that prior had not been on the rolls. And he won by roughly that number of votes. It's really interesting. If you'll recall, the Biden administration had SWAT teams come in and raid a number of dairy farms because of raw milk. And I hope that the people that made the calls on those raids are now regretting that decision, because I think it cost them Pennsylvania. Although, to be fair, there's probably another reason that the Amish are a little more politically motivated than just the raw milk stuff and the being raided by jackbooted thugs. There's been a pretty large contingent of Lancaster County Amish folks coming down and helping rebuild in North Carolina. They're seeing with their own eyes the complete incompetence, or worse, of the federal government in disaster management and cleanup down there. So that could also be a factor. I think Kamala Harris lost North Carolina extremely decisively when there was basically nothing done, and she flew in just for a photo op and then straight out to record a podcast right after. Absolutely no leadership being displayed. I think that was a gigantic failure on her part. A bunch of other people swept in. Elon Musk turned on Starlink and all these other things. There were a whole bunch of other people who supported folks in North Carolina and have built some political alliances around that. And the mainstream media has noticed. Rachel Maddow was saying a couple days ago how if Kamala Harris wins, the first thing that she needs to do is get rid of all of Elon Musk's contacts, take his companies away from him, take his contracts away from him, make sure the government never relies upon Starlink or SpaceX ever again, because his opinions are the incorrect ones. And this is an incredibly dumb thing on a number of levels. Number one, Rachel Maddow probably doesn't realize that there are no competitors to SpaceX that the government and the military can just switch over to. In fact, just recently, SpaceX was the backup option for getting NASA spacemen down. I think we're supposed to say space persons down from the International Space Station when Boeing failed to come through, and there weren't really any other options. So the idea that you can just switch to non-existent options is a pretty common one inside of the mainstream media, but also the idea that you punish successful businessmen if they have the wrong opinions, or you nationalize successful businesses when they make semi-nationalized businesses look bad. also pretty common. But other people also noticed that there's this link between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. So Dogecoin is an all-time high. Bitcoin is at an all-time high. The stock market has rallied. Tesla stock is up. All these things that have happened since the direction of the election became visible around 9:30-ish. That's been really interesting to watch too. So yeah, by 9 o'clock, MSNBC was starting to cry about the Electoral College. That's when I knew that things were probably over. At that point, they didn't know that Donald Trump was going to take the popular election too. And now they've kind of stopped talking about Electoral College nonsense, which is nice. I'm glad that popular vote really has simplified a lot of things moving forward. I think that's why we're seeing less unrest and we're not seeing a whole lot of wrangling about Electoral College stuff. On 9:30, CNN, Mark Lauder came on and he said the Democrats are down 1.7 million early votes in those battleground states, specifically in urban areas where they are supposed to win. They're supposed to always win. Down 1.4 million votes in the battleground states among women voters. Again, women voters were supposed to come out 100% on the side of Harris, and they didn't. Rural voters have overperformed in early voting by 300,000. Like, these were all things that we were told weren't going to happen, and it was obvious they were happening. Even in places like Dearborn, Michigan, where you would expect it has been a Democratic stronghold for a whole bunch of different reasons, Harris only got 18% of that vote. Jill Stein beat Harris in Dearborn, Michigan. It's kind of fascinating. The other really interesting thing, and I don't know exactly what this means, and I don't know how aggressively to pursue these two different possibilities on a podcast that I would like to, stay on the air, but undeniably, Biden outperformed Harris in every county if you compare the 2024 and the 2020 elections. There is not a single district where Harris had more votes or even matched Biden's performance from 4 years ago. There's a bunch of reasons that this is interesting, and there's basically two possibilities. One is that she is just a deeply, deeply uninspiring candidate, and she couldn't even come close to touching him anywhere. But if that's true, if that's all it is, there's got to be one county, there's got to be one district somewhere where the people were not interested in a crusty old white Joe Biden character, and they did like this young, fresh, extremely ethnically valuable candidate in the intersectional sort of space. Surely there's got to be a single county or a single district where the numbers are off. The other option is that Joe Biden's numbers were artificially high in some way that I won't speculate about, and nobody will ever be able to touch that again without the same sort of boost. So yeah, the fact that there is this uniform failure to perform in every single district is fascinating to me. And I think that you should look at the maps. The maps are interesting. I think it's a 270 to win that has the main one that most people are looking at, and it shows the Electoral College votes. But there's also a fascinating map that you can look at that shows the different districts and counties. And there's a little red arrow pointing to the right and a little blue arrow pointing to the left based on how those changed since the last election over the last 4 years. It is just an overwhelming sea of red arrows showing a shift towards Republican votes, and then just a couple of blue arrows in a couple of places. So that sea change is pretty fascinating. Even Minnesota elected more Republican legislators. So Tim Walz has lost control of the House, and it's kind of interesting to see this attitude across the nation. And this is all, by the way, despite the mainstream media and the regime spending the last 4 years telling us what a fantastic job Joe Biden has been doing, and spending the last 100 days talking about what an amazing candidate Harris will be, what an amazing leader she will be. And it's pretty obvious that the people don't believe any of this. The vast majority of Americans are uninspired or convinced of the opposite based on the voting record. And it's just fascinating to me that the regime has spent 8 years telling us that Donald Trump is a racist, and he is still winning the black vote and the Latino vote, which we were told is impossible. I've never really seen the media so out of touch. That's not quite true. I've never seen the media so obviously out of touch and so surprised by something that is obviously false, their own narrative. The CNN commentators took it pretty hard. They promised that they would keep fighting, despite the fact that they are, supposed to be impartial journalists just commenting. But Joy Reid was also very funny. She assured viewers on the front end that she and other journalists had done everything that was possible to defeat Trump, because that is, after all, MSNBC's job as an impartial, unbiased news network. And then MSNBC, other people said later, like, we're still in it. We're still in the fight. Which I thought was also pretty funny. So at the end of the night, I would say it was media that took the biggest beating, even more than Democratic candidates, even more than the regime. It was media that came out super, super strong against Trump and his supporters, and to the point where they were scuttling their own ratings. And one of the things that I think would be kind of fascinating, I don't want to put ideas in anybody's heads, but television commercials are terrible now. They represent just a tiny swath of the actual American economy. If you watch modern American television, you will see primarily pharmaceutical ads. If somebody who has recently been elected president and somebody who has recently joined Donald Trump's team decided that the best thing for the mental health of the American people is to ban pharmaceutical companies from advertising SSRIs on television, I think that would be kind of interesting. It makes sense. You're not allowed to advertise tobacco or alcohol products these ways, so you could probably do the same with some of these other pharmaceutical products. And I think that if that would happen, it would have an unbelievable impact on mainstream media, television specifically. I think that's where the vast majority of the revenue is coming from at this point. I'm not recommending that happen. I'm just saying it would be a really interesting thing to watch. The biggest winner of the night was probably X, formerly known as Twitter. They had record traffic. Elon Musk had the best up-to-date information on his personal platform, which he really doesn't treat it like his own personal platform. He talks very much about it being our platform, it being open to everybody, and he certainly runs it more like that than any of the other social media platforms, and certainly more like that than any of the other networks. The MSNBC folks and the ABC folks and the CNN folks occasionally talked about America as a large, all-inclusive group, but they spent more time bashing America for making the wrong decisions than trying to be one of us. So yeah, X came across really well. And generally, I would say X's commentators throughout the night and even over the last week have been way more accurate in predicting what was going to happen than mainstream media's best pollsters. 538, Nate Silver, and Seltzer. These are just terrible, terrible predictions that they had last week. The very last bombshell poll that everybody ran with as conclusive was this massive lead that Harris was going to have in Iowa. And Iowa, of course, went straight to Trump. So, the journalists last night were still saying, like, how could this happen? Because Kamala Harris ran a perfect campaign. No mistakes. They were saying that last night, by the way. I'm just pointing that out. I'm not going to mention any particular mistakes, although I will say not showing up to her own watch party is not a good look. And then the woman who is speaking did not show up to tell anyone that she wasn't going to show up. She sent a man to do that for her. And then they forgot to turn off the happy party music when all the people just kind of trickled out of the Howard University room that they were in. So yeah, that might have been a mistake. There were a lot of mistakes that I think that the mainstream media and the regime made over the last 4 years. And I think that the January 6th trial and persecution stuff really, really backfired. The assumption that women are going to vote for the most female leader that we've ever had, even though she's the least inspiring leader we ever have, just so they can say that there's a woman in the White House. I think that's incredibly backfired, especially since we're still arguing over what a woman is. Then this idea that men will vote for Kamala Harris because they love their daughters so much that they will ensure that their daughters have the freedom to murder their own grandchildren. Like, that was a crazy bit of campaign marketing. Those ads were incredible to watch, but I don't think they were incredibly powerful for that particular side. Just pitching Kamala Harris as the pro-family candidate has been really interesting to watch. Just so many weird, awkward things. They tried to pitch the right-wingers as weird, but Kamala Harris was always doing really interesting things. Like last night, they had a bit where she pretended to talk to a voter on her phone, and she held up her phone, and it was the camera app. Like, this this kind of thing just happened over and over again for the last little while. So Donald Trump is going to be the next president. He's either the first president to win 2 non-consecutive terms since Grover Cleveland, or he might be the first president to win 3 consecutive terms since FDR, but I wouldn't comment on which. So the biggest question that I would ask is, what now? If you're not part of the transition team, then you will be a little bit less busy than some folks, but don't assume that all the work is going to be done for you over the next 4 years. Now that Hitler has been elected to the highest law in the land, I don't really know what the media pundits are going to do. They're already talking about how the fact that 53 to 54% of all Americans are also Hitler. But I just don't think that's sustainable for them, especially not with their current ratings. And I think that the popular vote win, not only does it mean a lot less of that wrangling, that legal wrangling and talking about what the Electoral College is for and how idiotic the founding fathers were to put it in place. I think it's also demoralized a whole bunch of the rioters. So Antifa did do some stuff last night in Portland, but it seemed like they were actually angrier at Harris than they were at Trump. It's been hugely demoralizing as opposed to infuriating for the groups that I've been keeping a specific eye on. I don't know that that's going to be the case for long. I think that there's a very good possibility that as we get closer to the certification, which Kamala Harris will have to do, by the way, and the inauguration, that people will get some of their fire back and we will actually start to see a little bit more unrest. That is distinctly a possibility on the horizon. And then when Trump gets into office, hopefully, inevitably, that will actually happen. We will experience a bit of a breather in this country. We will have less pressure from the DOJ. We'll have less weaponized regime against us. But I think that all of us will still feel more pressure from media, more pressure from banks and private companies that are aligned with the regime. They're still going to have exactly the same motives and motivations, and they don't have the same level of accountability under a new president as direct DOJ departments do. So when Donald Trump gets in, he's going to replace as many members of the bureaucracy as he can, and he's going to get the best people that he can pick. His first term, he took a lot of bad advice, which I think he realizes now was bad advice. And he tried to work very closely with the GOP because he wanted them to help him get a second term. Well, all of that's kind of off the table now. So I anticipate that he will make better picks, and that's going to be very effective. That being said, the federal government is an extremely large thing. There's 24 million government employees in this country that are not going to be replaced by cabinet positions or administrative appointments. So bear that in mind. The most interesting thing, I think, to watch will be the Overton window. A couple of years ago, I think it was around the time of the midterm elections, I recorded a podcast. The title was something like, "The Overton Window is Broken." There's 2 Overton windows. There's these 2 echo chambers that exist, and that was very much on display last night. The American people went out and voted as members of a group that were very interested in having a change of leadership. And the mainstream media and the regime over here were completely flabbergasted by this. They had absolutely no conception of how this would happen. The only thing that might possibly shed some light on this is 54% of Americans are legit Nazis, perhaps. These 2 echo chambers are further and further apart. But going back to X, formerly Twitter, it's really interesting how this allows us to see into both echo chambers. A lot of the algorithms have changed over the years, so I was able to see on my timeline a whole bunch of people in both groups talking. And hopefully, over time, there is a little bit of a reintegration. People in the mainstream media will realize that people in the ground don't listen to them anymore, and if they want to keep their ratings and they want to continue to sell, TV commercial space for Ozempic or whatever, they're going to need to connect with that audience. And people on the right are going to understand that people on the left are legitimately baffled by what is going on, and we need to do a better job of communicating with them. I think that will happen because largely Elon Musk, which is kind of fascinating. But despite really fascinating wins, despite people who are completely out of touch being shocked by the results, it was always kind of fun to watch, I have to admit. there still are a bunch of things that we need to do. I mentioned before some of the constitutional amendments that were voted through set us back, and I think that there is going to continue to be a huge amount of pressure, and possibly we will see more unrest as we get closer to January. I want to give the last word of this podcast to an old friend of mine, George Grant. Last week, I was at the Fight, Laugh, Feast conference down in Fort Worth, and George Grant had the best take on this election on Saturday afternoon. He didn't even write this. He just said this off the cuff because it was a Q&A panel sort of thing. Somebody asked him about the election, and he said, a second Trump presidency, if Trump wins, will not be a cure for anything. It's not a solution for anything. It is a tourniquet. It stops the bleeding, and if we can stop the bleeding, then we can start to go to work on solutions. So a fantastic quote from George Grant, who's right here in Tennessee. I should really try to get him on the podcast and we can discuss some of these things. But I really think that that is a phenomenal take. We have put a tourniquet on just the hemorrhaging of money and principle that we've experienced for the last, not just 4 years, but for most of my lifetime. That being said, you're listening to the T-Rex Talk podcast. You know the tourniquets are not a permanent solution. A tourniquet, you write the time on it, and you have a very limited amount of time to actually address the root causes of the injury and try to bring actual healing. So let's not be complacent, even though Trump has the White House, the House, the Senate, and a bunch of Republican governors. Let's not be complacent because now is the time for the real work to begin. So thanks for listening to that podcast. We already sent out a political newsletter, probably by the time you watch this. If you're subscribed to the political newsletter, we comment on these things, and it's shorter and a little more to the point than these rambly conversations. But the other reason to subscribe to the newsletter is that it gives you information about sales, and it lets you start certain sales earlier, like the Black Friday sale. So if you're not subscribed, go check it out.